As the housing bubble was about to burst, a handful of unique minds realized what was going on and bet against the American economy, and were right. This week we are reviewing The Big Short by Michael Lewis. Here are 5 things you will love or love to hate about The Big Short. Number 1, the freight train known as Steve Eisman. Steve Eisman careened through various careers in high finance and became disenfranchised by what he saw as big banks taking advantage of poor people. He described several shady business practices that left him sour on the banking industry. One such practice was showing effective interest rates applicable to a 30-year mortgage when advertising a 15-year mortgage. That would make the interest rate appear lower than it actually is. Another practice he's critical of is free checking accounts. I never thought free checking was anything sinister, but according to Eisman, banks do this to attract poor people who are more likely to overdraw their accounts, causing NSF fees. We've all heard of the practice of cashing the largest check first so that banks can bounce multiple small checks. And in 2020, banks took in $30 billion in overdraft fees. So if you ever bounce a check, you should not feel compelled to apologize to your bank. They're actually quite happy with the $35 fee over your responsible financial decisions any day. It should be noted that banks taking advantage of poor people will be a recurring theme throughout this book. Even though Steve Eisman earns his living at Front Point Partners, which is a division of Morgan Stanley, he is disgusted by Wall Street and takes it out in the form of an aggressive personality. A friend who is a hedge fund manager describes him. He's sort of a prick in a way, but he's smart and honest and fearless. And here's what his wife told the author. Eisman had what amounted to a talent for offending people. He's not tactically rude, his wife explains. He's sincerely rude. Even on Wall Street, people think he's rude, obnoxious, and aggressive. Yes, that's his wife talking about him. It's interesting to note she's quoted several times throughout the book, but never seems judgmental of her husband's negative and obnoxious character. She presents it in a matter-of-fact sort of way, and we feel like she's a very empathetic and patient person. One day, as Eisman and his team at Front Point are reviewing their portfolio of specialty financing, they notice something odd. Specialty financing is the new term for subprime loans. They also call them shitty and crappy. The author isn't shy about using these adjectives to describe the assets these guys are trading. What the Front Point team notices is that bad loans are being packaged with good loans and branded as AAA rated bonds, better known as mortgage-backed securities. Despite the subprime components, somehow these securities are garnering AAA ratings by Moody's and Standard & Poor's. Eisman's team realizes that the bad loans are being diluted into the good loans and at an alarming rate. The more they dig, the more they are astounded to find that the mortgage-backed security market is built on a giant shaky foundation. And it's not just a few of the bonds, there's an entire process to perpetuate this monster snowball. Lenders approve the subprime loans, then immediately sell them off to a bank so they can be interwoven with good loans. One big problem though, there are so many subprime loans intertwined that the bonds are extremely overrated, literally overrated, as the credit agencies hand out AAA ratings to all the mortgage-backed securities without much scrutiny. The securities are so diluted down with bad loans that a downturn in the housing prices was no longer needed to cause a crash. A mere stabilization would do the trick. As the author concludes, home prices didn't even need to fall, they merely needed to stop rising at the unprecedented rates they had the previous few years for vast numbers of Americans to default on their home loans. But Eisman's team wasn't the only big short out there, and that leads us to number 2, Cornwall Capital. Michael Burry is an introverted eccentric who is misdiagnosed with bipolar. He's a physician who started blogging about stock picks and was right most of the time and eventually started his own hedge fund. As a child, he suffered a rare cancer that took one of his eyes, making him quite literally myopic. His son exhibits behavioral issues at school, and he is diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. Michael Burry shakes his head since, as a former physician, he knows that Asperger's has been overdiagnosed. He also observes to his wife that his son is normal. After all, he knows he's normal because Burry acted the same way when he was his age, and well, there's good reason for that. As it turns out, Dad is also diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. Burry's a little shocked at first, but it all sort of makes sense now as to why he is the way he is. It also explains why he's able to digest large amounts of financial information, and he too is someone who thought it would actually be a good idea to look inside the portfolio of managed-backed securities, which everyone assumes to be safe. And just like Steve Eisman's team, he's shocked as to how many subprime mortgages are interlaced with good ones. Later on, he observes, only someone who has Asperger's would read a subprime mortgage bond perspective. Apparently nobody in the banking industry bothers to read these things. But they aren't the only ones. We are introduced to a third team of investors. Number 3, Cornwall Capital. Charlie Ledley and Jamie Mai run a small private hedge fund out of a studio in the Village right below artist Julian Schnabel. A garage band hedge fund is what their third partner Ben Hockett refers to it as. Ben Hockett is introduced as a burnt-out fund manager who simply hated office life at Deutsche Bank. I told him I don't like going into an office. I don't like wearing a suit, and I don't like living in a big city. And they said fine. They told him he could wear whatever he wanted to wear, live where he wanted to live, and work wherever he wanted to work. Ben eventually crosses paths with Charlie and Jamie and their hedge fund, and the three become partners. Ben comes off as an unwilling mentor to the two younger and eager garage band hedge fund managers. The pair want to know everything about Ben's experience with Deutsche Bank, since private hedge funds are looked down upon as second-class citizens by the much larger institutional hedge funds. Charlie and Jamie want a seat at the adult table, and Ben can help them get there. But the unlikely threesome are united on one front. They have a preoccupation with the world ending. Ben lives off the grid on a farm and grows his own food while managing money. Charlie and Jamie are fascinated with betting on chaotic events happening in the world, since Wall Street tends to underemphasize negative events from happening. Financial options were systematically mispriced. The market often underestimated the likelihood of extreme moves in prices. The options market also tended to presuppose that the distant future would look more like the present than it usually did. And so we get to know the three groups that are the big shorts. As the reader, we wonder why the vivid backgrounds of these characters are important until we realize that it took unique and unconventional mindsets to spot what was going on while everyone else went with the flow. Steve Eisman is an eccentric who fancies himself a fighter for the little man and doesn't mind being abrasive and in your face and defying the authority and convention of institutional finance. Michael Burry is a myopic person with Asperger's who buries himself in technical data. Charlie, Jamie, and Ben of Cornwall Capital are fascinated on how they can bet on the end of the world. It really did take outside-the-box, eccentric personalities to defy convention and see what nobody else saw coming. All of this culminates in a fact-finding mission, and that leads us to number 4, the Vegas trip. All the big shorts find themselves at a Vegas convention attended by everyone involved in subprime lending. The reason for the trip? Even though the big shorts have overwhelming evidence that the housing market is about to crash, it's not enough. They just don't believe what they've stumbled into. They must confirm if the knowledge they have is true. This is a common human trait where one must seek validation from others despite a tsunami of evidence right before one's eyes. Steve Eisman finagles a dinner with a man named Wing Chow, a CDO manager who is on the other side of the short bet he was making. Eisman finds this man despicable, and after dinner, he is obsessed with betting against the CDO managers. He wants to stick it to men like Wing Chow, who exist in a sea of degenerate gamblers. And the setting of Las Vegas seems like a perfect metaphor for what they are doing, as the author compares the housing market to roulette and craps. The reason casinos bothered to list the wheel's most recent spins? To help gamblers delude themselves, to give people the false confidence they needed to lay their chips on the roulette table. The entire food chain of intermediaries in the subprime mortgage market was duping itself with the same trick, using the foreshortened, statistically meaningless past to predict the future. That craps was the game of choice of the bond trader was interesting, though. Craps offered the player the illusion of control, after all he rolled the dice, and a surface complexity that masked its deeper idiocy. And if you've seen the movie, this is the scene in the casino with Selena Gomez and this Asian actor. I don't know who this guy is, but he steals the entire movie with this one scene and his abysmal sliminess. His scene alone is enough to watch the movie. It really is a wonderful scene. But back to the book. There's an unmistakable obsessiveness shared by the big shorts on the Vegas Strip. They need to confirm that the information they have is actually true. The Vegas Strip cements their knowledge, and they leave with the intention of shorting even larger amounts with even more urgency. Number 5, the narrative. The book, of course, has a strong narrative that greed, bankers, and Wall Street fat cats are what caused the housing crash, through a perfect storm of short-term lending policies and a case of the right hand not knowing what the left was doing. The subprime mortgage industry, Eisman once knew better than anyone on the planet, had become a negligible corner of the capital markets. In just a few short years, it had somehow become the most powerful engine of profits and employment on Wall Street, and it made no economic sense. It was like watching an unthinking machine that could not stop itself. And Steve Eisman is still bitter. He tells the author, "The upper middle class of this country raped this country. You fucked people. You built a castle to rip people off. Not once in all these years have I come across a person inside a big Wall Street bank firm who is not having a crisis of conscience. Nobody ever said this is wrong, and nobody ever gave a shit about what I had to say." But here's one big problem I had with this book. The narrative that big banks, greed, and Wall Street caused the housing bubble is completely, totally, unequivocally wrong. They did have a house of cards that came tumbling down in 2008, but what was at the bottom that allowed banks to make such irresponsible loans to people who couldn't afford them? The answer? Government. Of course, big bankers have always been wonderful villains in fiction, going back to the Frank Capra movies and Grapes of Wrath, but the book lets the well-intentioned do-gooders who laid the foundation of the housing bubble off the hook too easily. The government providing a secondary mortgage market through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is what allowed the banks to make the irresponsible loans in the first place, since they had the backing of the American taxpayer. The moral hazard had been eliminated, causing banks to view these subprime loans as risk-free. And one reason nobody went to jail is because they didn't do anything illegal. One could even argue that these banks didn't do anything unethical either. After all, the policy of the late 90s and the early 2000s was that everyone should be a homeowner. The banks found a creative way to make that happen. They did nothing wrong. They actually did exactly what the government wanted them to do. And all of us are guilty of being part of this scheme. Home builders, realtors, and banks loved it, of course, but so did everyone else. Middle-class folks got to see their homes double in value. Activist groups like Acorn got the trumpet of victory by making home ownership more available to minorities. Even automakers loved it because people used home equity loans to buy gas-guzzling SUVs, which means the oil companies loved it too. Everyone had their hand in the pie. At the time of the financial crisis, subpar mortgages were around 30% of all mortgages. We all knew someone back in the early 2000s who had bought a house that we suspected they couldn't afford. The book mentions a Mexican strawberry picker with a $750,000 home and a Las Vegas stripper with 5 investment properties. The author actually mentions the government's role in the housing bubble, but in this entire 266-page book, it dedicates 2 little sentences at the bottom of page 7 to address this, and here they are. The pool of loans underlying the mortgage bond confirmed to the standards in their size and the credit quality of the borrowers set out by one of several government agencies, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, and Ginnie Mae. The loans carried, in effect, government guarantees. If the homeowners defaulted, the government paid off their debts. That right there is the answer about what caused the housing bubble, but the author insists on dedicating the book to blaming the bankers. If you want an adult version of what really happened that dives into this with more detail and comes to the correct conclusion, check out Peter J. Wallison's book, Hidden in Plain Sight. Although Hollywood is probably not going to turn this book into a movie anytime soon. Despite that shortcoming, I still enjoyed this book about a couple of rogue investors and their story about how they saw the elephant in the room that nobody else could see. It's definitely worth your time. That's it for this week. Don't forget to hit subscribe. And if you like books about eccentric thinkers, check out my own book, Grand Portage, about a man who buys a nuclear aircraft carrier and drags it across northern Minnesota. It's available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. Remember to always diversify your portfolio and never stop reading.